Andrew Tate, a name once associated with kickboxing championships and flashy social media fame, exploded into the global spotlight for reasons far beyond sports or entrepreneurship. Born Emory Andrew Tate III in Washington, D.C., he grew up in both the U.S. and the U.K., raised by a chess master father and a hardworking mother. His early life was marked by intense discipline and a desire to prove himself. After gaining recognition as a four-time world kickboxing champion, Tate turned to online business ventures. He launched courses on wealth creation, masculinity, and influence through platforms like Hustlers University, quickly amassing a cult-like online following. His content, filled with hyper-masculine philosophies, anti-feminist rants, and brash provocations, earned him millions of fans, and just as many critics. By mid-2022, Tate had become one of the most Googled individuals in the world, polarizing audiences with every post. But behind the viral clips and Lamborghini rides, authorities in Romania were investigating a far darker reality. Tate had moved to Romania years earlier, claiming that Eastern European law enforcement was less corrupt and more fair toward men. In reality, this move would become a central focus of the criminal investigation that would soon unfold. Romanian authorities had placed Andrew Tate and his brother Tristan under surveillance for months. Accusations were piling up from women alleging they had been lured to Romania under false pretenses, trapped in Tate's compound, and coerced into performing explicit content on webcam for money. These weren't just rumors circulating in tabloids. They were backed by formal complaints, international cooperation between Romanian and U.S. law enforcement, and ongoing digital surveillance. On December 29, 2022, Romanian anti-organized crime officers raided Tate's mansion in Bucharest. Footage of the dramatic arrest circulated online within hours, showing armed officers in tactical gear escorting the Tate brothers out of their home in handcuffs. Authorities announced that the brothers were being investigated for human trafficking, rape, and forming an organized crime group to exploit women. The internet erupted. Supporters of Andrew Tate immediately claimed that this was a matrix attack, a term he often used to describe elite forces trying to silence him for speaking out against modern society's power structures. Like Free Top G and The Matrix is Real trended across Twitter and TikTok. Meanwhile, critics called for justice and urged social platforms to stop giving Tate visibility. As Tate was placed into custody for a 30-day pre-trial detention, later extended multiple times, the world watched as a social media icon turned into an international criminal suspect. Yet even from jail, his team continued to post cryptic messages on his behalf, fueling conspiracies, feeding his loyal base, and painting the arrest as a political hit job. Behind the scenes, prosecutors were busy building a case. They claimed that Tate and his associates would use the lover boy method to recruit women, manipulating them into thinking they were in romantic relationships before forcing them into the adult entertainment industry. 6 victims had already come forward, and authorities promised more would follow. The spotlight wasn't just on Tate, it was on the very ecosystem that had helped him rise. His ban from major platforms earlier in 2022 had not slowed his influence. In fact, many of his videos were reposted by fans, gaining hundreds of millions of views. Algorithms had amplified his message. Schools were reporting incidents of young boys parroting Tate's misogynistic views, sparking concern among parents and educators. As 2023 approached, the question wasn't just about Andrew Tate's guilt or innocence. It was about how digital fame, unchecked influence, and toxic masculinity had collided to create a global controversy that no one could ignore. The story was only beginning to unfold. As news of Andrew Tate's arrest spread globally, the internet became a chaotic battlefield of conflicting opinions. On one side were mainstream media outlets and human rights advocates condemning his alleged actions and raising awareness about the dangers of online radicalization. On the other side stood a growing army of followers who viewed Tate not as a criminal, but as a martyr fighting against what they called an oppressive system. Influencers, streamers, and content creators rushed to analyze the story. Some distanced themselves from Tate immediately, fearing association with the allegations. Others doubled down in their support, claiming he had been framed by a global elite afraid of his outspoken views on masculinity, power, and government overreach. In comment sections, live stream chats, and Reddit threads, thousands of voices clashed, exposing just how divided public opinion had become. Romania's legal system was suddenly under an international microscope. Critics questioned whether Tate would receive a fair trial, while others accused Romanian authorities of being too lenient for having allowed the alleged abuse to go on for so long. Prosecutors in Bucharest maintained their stance, asserting that they had been quietly building the case for months and that the December raid was not a spontaneous act but a calculated legal strike. Meanwhile, the victims who had come forward were facing public scrutiny, harassment, and disbelief. Tate's online army was relentless. Some victims reported receiving death threats and abusive messages, prompting Romanian authorities to implement protective measures. Activists raised concerns about how difficult it is for victims of high-profile figures to come forward, especially when the accused wields massive digital influence. While legal proceedings were underway in Romania, international law enforcement agencies remained involved. U.S. authorities were believed to be coordinating with Romanian prosecutors, and there were discussions about potential extradition if new evidence surfaced linking Tate's operations to crimes committed outside Romanian borders. At the same time, Tate's brand refused to fade. Even in detention, content attributed to him continued to flood platforms like TikTok, YouTube, and Telegram. It was unclear whether these were pre-scheduled posts, coordinated efforts by his team, or simply fan-made compilations. But the message remained consistent. Tate's online presence was alive, powerful, and defiant. His loyalists painted the narrative of a man wrongfully imprisoned for telling uncomfortable truths. In contrast, those critical of Tate pointed to years of misogynistic behavior, interviews where he appeared to justify violence against women, and prior bans from social platforms as evidence of a long-standing pattern. The controversy highlighted a disturbing reality about digital culture. Algorithms favored extremism. Content that outraged or provoked people performed better, and Andrew Tate had mastered that formula. He wasn't just a man with an opinion. He had become a brand, an icon of resistance for some, and a symbol of online toxicity for others. Schools in multiple countries began issuing warnings about his influence. Teachers noticed students repeating Tate's catchphrases, mocking female classmates, and dismissing discussions on equality. It had become a cultural issue, not just a legal one. Journalists covering the story often found themselves targeted as well. Accusations of media bias flew from both sides. Some accused outlets of being complicit in Tate's rise by previously platforming him. Others argued that media coverage was overly sympathetic to the victims and not giving enough voice to Tate's version of events. In interviews and court statements, Tate maintained his innocence. He argued that the charges were politically motivated and that the women involved were lying for personal gain or under outside influence. His legal team described the case as flimsy and flawed, claiming that the evidence was circumstantial and the witnesses unreliable. But the case was progressing. Romanian authorities released more details, including testimony from multiple women, financial records tied to adult webcam businesses, and surveillance footage believed to be from inside Tate's compound. Each new development sparked further debate online. Was this a legitimate criminal investigation or a character assassination? As the legal proceedings dragged on, Andrew Tate's future remained uncertain. But one thing was clear. The world was watching. The trial was no longer just about one man. It had become a reflection of how the internet empowers personalities, distorts truth, and complicates the pursuit of justice in the digital age. As the investigation deepened in early 2023, Romanian prosecutors began revealing the scope of the allegations against Andrew Tate, his brother Tristan, and two Romanian female associates. The group was accused of forming a criminal organization designed to recruit, exploit, and control women through psychological manipulation and coercion, ultimately forcing them into sex work and online adult content creation. Prosecutors detailed what they called the lover boy method, a tactic involving false romantic promises. Women were allegedly convinced They were entering serious relationships with Tate or his associates. Once relocated to Romania, these women found themselves isolated inside a guarded compound with limited contact with the outside world. Surveillance footage reportedly captured emotional outbursts, scenes of distress, and what authorities described as behavioral conditioning by the accused. One victim described being stripped of her passport and phone, subjected to constant monitoring, and ordered to perform explicit acts on webcam for online subscribers. Others described similar experiences, claiming that any resistance was met with verbal threats, emotional manipulation, and in some cases physical intimidation. Authorities alleged that the victims were coached to appear willing on camera, while, in reality, they were living in a state of psychological captivity. Among the mounting evidence were private WhatsApp and Telegram messages between the accused, where prosecutors claimed they discussed quotas for daily income, strategies to silence, or control certain girls and tactics to avoid legal exposure. Financial documents showed the Tate brothers earning hundreds of thousands of dollars monthly from their adult content business, money that prosecutors argued was the product of systematic exploitation. As these details surfaced, public opinion remained sharply divided. Supporters of Andrew Tate dismissed the women's stories as lies, suggesting they were opportunists trying to bring down a successful man. They argued that all interactions were consensual and that no evidence of physical violence or direct threats had been proven. They pointed to Tate's own statements in interviews where he boasted about how women willingly worked for him, claiming he provided them with luxury lifestyles in exchange. However, prosecutors countered that luxury did not negate coercion. They emphasized that manipulation, especially emotional manipulation in intimate relationships, could be just as controlling as physical force. They cited psychological evaluations of victims who displayed classic symptoms of trauma and abuse. One key piece of evidence was a video recorded by a victim shortly before she escaped the compound. In it, she whispered into the camera, hidden in a bathroom, begging for someone to help her and describing the surveillance she was under. The video quickly went viral after being leaked online, prompting even some of Tate's supporters to reconsider their stance. Another victim, a former girlfriend of Tristan Tate, testified in court that she had been convinced to move to Romania on the promise of marriage. Instead, she claimed she was stripped of her freedom and made to work in the adult industry, with all earnings controlled by the Tates. She described the brothers as charming manipulators who knew exactly how to maintain psychological control over women by mixing affection with fear. Meanwhile, international organizations began taking notice. The case was referenced by women's rights groups and legal scholars studying the intersection of online influence and real-world abuse. They noted how Tate's rise was emblematic of a broader issue: charismatic figures using social media to recruit and manipulate vulnerable individuals under the guise of empowerment or financial opportunity. Several online platforms came under renewed criticism for allowing Tate's content to proliferate even after his initial bans. TikTok and YouTube removed some of his videos, but reposts and fan accounts continued to thrive, often using coded language or different names to bypass moderation. The digital ecosystem had become an echo chamber of toxic masculinity, and Andrew Tate was at its center. Meanwhile, behind bars, Tate continued to portray himself as a victim. Through his lawyers and social media handlers, he released statements proclaiming his innocence, claiming the case was a government conspiracy to silence him for speaking uncomfortable truths. He alleged that Western elites were threatened by his views and wanted to make an example out of him. His prison conditions also became a subject of public debate. Tate described being locked in a cold cell with no heat and basic food, an environment he labeled inhumane. Romanian authorities insisted that he was being held according to European detention standards. The contrast between Tate's portrayal of himself as a suffering revolutionary and the victim's testimonies of abuse painted a disturbing duality. Each court appearance drew media attention, protesters, and fans outside the courthouse. The Tate brothers were often seen entering court in designer clothes, waving or flashing cryptic hand signs to the cameras, maintaining the spectacle that had always surrounded them. Yet as more victims came forward and more digital evidence emerged, it became increasingly difficult to separate the man from the allegations. The case was becoming not just a legal battle, but a cultural reckoning with everything Tate represented. As the Romanian court proceedings moved forward, Andrew Tate's legal defense shifted into high gear. His attorneys adopted a dual strategy. On one hand, they challenged the credibility of the accusers and the interpretation of evidence. On the other, they worked to reframe the narrative through global media and online platforms, painting Tate as a targeted figure, unjustly detained, for defying modern ideologies. In court, the defense argued that every woman who had stayed at Tate's residence did so voluntarily. They claimed that none of the alleged victims were physically restrained, and some had even traveled internationally with the Tates after their supposed abuse had occurred. They emphasized the lack of clear video evidence showing coercion, stressing that webcam work was a legal gray area in Romania and that contracts and consent were in place. Defense lawyers suggested that the victims were motivated by regret, embarrassment, or media influence, and that the case was built on misinterpretations and emotional testimony rather than hard proof. Prosecutors, however, held firm. They argued that psychological coercion was just as damaging as physical force. They emphasized patterns of grooming, emotional manipulation, and financial control. One victim reportedly handed over access to her bank accounts, claiming Tate had convinced her it was part of building shared wealth. Forensic evidence, including metadata from text messages, GPS data, and camera timestamps, was introduced to support the prosecution's timeline. These showed how often the women's movement was monitored and how they were allegedly discouraged from maintaining contact with friends or family. The digital trails began to form a troubling picture, even as the defense tried to poke holes in each detail. Outside the courtroom, the media circus never stopped. Every hearing was covered in real time by both traditional news outlets and independent creators on YouTube, Rumble, and X. Tate's supporters framed each court delay or lack of a formal indictment as proof that the case was falling apart. They circulated edited videos of Tate warning his audience about false accusations and claiming that jail time was part of the price for telling the truth. These messages often went viral, fueled by coordinated campaigns across fan-run accounts and online forums. Meanwhile, journalists and legal analysts pushed back against the misinformation. They pointed out that legal systems, especially in high-profile international cases, move slowly. Court delays were common, particularly when new evidence surfaced or witness protection became a concern. Many of Tate's supporters overlooked this, preferring to believe that delays equaled innocence. The courtroom wasn't the only battlefield. Media manipulation became a key part of Tate's survival strategy. Interviews were given to sympathetic influencers. Short videos showing him praying, meditating, or quoting Stoic philosophy from his jail cell were released to enhance his image. He was cast as a warrior monk, wrongfully imprisoned, but spiritually untouchable. These image-shaping efforts extended to his brother and alleged co-conspirators as well. Every appearance was staged with symbolic gestures, designer outfits, and coded language meant to signal resistance and strength. However, the story was not one-sided. Survivors of sex trafficking and abuse advocates spoke out on news platforms and social media, drawing attention to how easily online influence could mask real-world abuse. They emphasized that charisma and wealth often shield predators from scrutiny and warned of the broader implications of glorifying figures like Tate. Schools, especially in the UK and the US, continued to report challenges in classrooms where Tate's influence was being felt. Boys repeated misogynistic lines, mocked feminism, and dismissed lessons on consent, claiming that they were woke lies. Teachers were caught between the growing reach of internet ideologues and the reality of educating the next generation. Governments began issuing statements. In the UK, the Department for Education encouraged schools to openly discuss Tate's views and provide factual counter-narratives. In the European Union, digital policymakers debated tighter regulations on platforms that allowed dangerous ideologies to spread unchecked. Even tech companies came under fire. YouTube, TikTok, and X were accused of profiting from Tate-related content, much of which violated their own terms of service. The platforms responded inconsistently. Some removed his accounts, others allowed third-party reposts to continue generating millions of views. This inconsistency helped fuel the conspiracy theories. If his voice was so dangerous, why was it still everywhere? That question became a weapon for his defenders and a frustration for his critics. Meanwhile, inside the Romanian court system, a grand jury was convened to review the final indictment proposal. Leaks suggested that more than a dozen witnesses, thousands of pages of documentation, and several hours of surveillance footage were included in the files. A decision on whether to formally charge Tate was approaching. If indicted, he could face years in prison. If cleared, he would return to a digital empire larger than before. Either outcome carried massive consequences. It was no longer just about a man accused of trafficking. It was about the limits of law in the face of viral power. It was about how social media could build kings out of chaos. And the world was still watching, divided, and waiting for the next twist. As 2023 progressed into 2024, the fate of Andrew Tate remained unresolved. The Romanian legal system, known for its deliberate pace in high-profile cases, continued reviewing extensive evidence gathered over the past year. Despite months in detention, no formal conviction had yet been handed down. Tate and his legal team submitted multiple appeals for release, arguing that the ongoing incarceration without a finalized indictment violated his human rights. Courts repeatedly denied these requests, citing the ongoing investigation's complexity and the potential flight risk posed by Tate's international influence and wealth. From inside jail, Tate remained a public figure. Through his team, he continued posting cryptic quotes, religious reflections, and claims of spiritual enlightenment. He painted himself as a man being tested by fate, a warrior in a broken system. These carefully curated messages kept his loyal fan base engaged, especially among young men who saw him as a beacon of strength in a politically correct world. But beyond the spectacle, the reality was darker. The women involved in the case were undergoing therapy, living in protective environments, and preparing for a trial that would place their trauma under global scrutiny. Romanian authorities expanded their investigation to look into financial transactions, crypto wallets, and foreign business entities tied to the Tates. There were also discussions about potential victims in other countries. Law enforcement in the UK and the United States expressed interest in opening parallel inquiries based on the evidence shared from Romania. Despite mounting legal pressure, Tate's narrative continued to resonate with certain demographics. His messages were being translated into multiple languages and spread across developing nations where discussions on gender equality, consent, and digital ethics were still evolving. Analysts noted the danger of such unchecked ideology. Experts warned that Tate's success at leveraging controversy into influence was setting a precedent for future internet personalities. Platforms that once banned him were slowly showing signs of retreat. New Tate-themed channels emerged, claiming to be news or commentary, but functioning as echo chambers of his ideology. Clips of his interviews, pre-arrest speeches, and motivational rants continued to circulate, often divorced from context and repackaged as life advice. For critics, it was frustrating proof that social media algorithms favored provocation over principle. The discussion extended far beyond one individual. The case became a flashpoint in debates over masculinity, victim advocacy, media responsibility, and the psychological warfare of internet culture. Schools, parents, and policymakers were now tasked with explaining to a new generation how charisma can manipulate truth and how being popular does not equate to being right. Meanwhile, Andrew Tate's public image became a paradox. To some, he was a cult leader of male empowerment. To others, he was the embodiment of exploitation disguised as confidence. His story was being studied in universities, debated in parliament chambers, and referenced in boardrooms where tech companies considered future guidelines on influencer accountability. In mid-2024, Romanian authorities officially submitted the indictment papers. The charges were serious: human trafficking, rape, and organized crime. The court set a trial date, which would be open to international media. The world braced for what promised to be one of the most publicly dissected legal battles of the internet age. Supporters launched donation campaigns and called for global protests. Critics prepared legal analyses, educational programs, and victim support initiatives. The digital world prepared for another explosion of opinion, misinformation, and conflict. Whatever the verdict, the Andrew Tate saga had already reshaped online culture. It exposed vulnerabilities in how influence is measured, how justice is perceived, and how truth is contested in an age where every voice can be amplified or erased at the swipe of a screen. As the trial loomed, one thing was clear. The story of Andrew Tate was not just about a man who rose to fame and fell into controversy. It was about the systems that allowed it, the minds it shaped, and the consequences that followed when power met unchecked influence. Whether he would be found guilty or innocent, Tate's name had become more than a headline. It was a mirror reflecting the chaos of the internet era, the fragility of facts, and the ongoing battle between justice and noise.